Welcome back. In this video what we're gonna do is we're gonna turn this mock-up we have on the right hand side here and turn it into a full tattoo design. Let's start out by deactivating the vertical mirror. And what I always do is I take the first layer where we have the rough draft and give it just a tiny bit of opacity, just keep it like in the background, because I have drawn it just for composition purposes only. Let's create a new layer and move over into our design folder, which is here. And in the resources folder, I did already some image research with the search engines I was showing you in the previous video. And I just found this bird silhouette, I found this very appealing lotus flower. I found some geometry elements and of course the meditator, which will be the center part of the design. And that is the reason why I'm gonna drag and drop this right into my Photoshop, which will open up here. I see it has like some color tinting to it, which I don't like, so I press Command U, go into hue and saturation, desaturate the picture because I don't want to have any color fragments in my black and gray designs. Then I have selected the background layer. I will create with Command J a copy of this layer. Click one more time on the background, create a solid color. In this case, I'm gonna go with a black because I need maximum contrast to the background. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna create a mask for this entire object, so it's easier for me to include it into my design composition. Sometimes throughout this video I will also speed up some of the processes, but I will try to keep as much as authentic as possible because I want you to see really what are the steps and what it takes me from going from the rough mock-up to the final design. Let's actually click on layer number 1, create the mask over here. I'm using brush, pressing the B key, using the brackets, switching my primary and secondary color with X, so I can start drawing with black into the mask. And that's exactly what we're gonna do now. I found using the brush tool for masking out objects the most convenient still, even if it takes a bit more time, but the results usually are way better than what you would get if you would use, for example, the magic wand and just erase the backdrop, which usually leaves some ugly artifacts in the design, which we try to avoid. I will also work very cautiously around the ear area to make sure that I'm not accidentally cutting off any parts of the ear of the meditator. Even if something happens like here where we accidentally cut too much off from the head, this is no problem at all. We just use the X key, we switch the primary and secondary color, and then we can pretty much just draw back whatever element we accidentally erased. I just want to emphasize, I'm not drawing with black on the photograph of the meditator. I'm drawing with black on the mask, which means the black you're actually seeing right now is only the background layer, which is underneath here, the color fill. As you can see, this is already masked out. Let's keep going with the cutout. Obviously, you don't have to do this with every single image you have. Sometimes the magic wand can work if the design has a lot of contrast to the background. But as soon as you have like any forms of blurry backgrounds, or you have like in this example a high key image where there's not a lot of contrast between the main element in the front and the backdrop. In this case, I can highly recommend you to mask out the entire object by hand. And later on, if you want to print out the design, it will actually look better on it, in my opinion. And I think this process also illustrates very well why the rough drafting at the beginning was so crucial, because if we would start doing these kind of compositions and making all the work by cutting out image material without even knowing if we're going to use this design later on for our final composition. Sometimes during an entire designing process, I can come up with maybe like 3 rough drafts just to make sure that I have the catching idea. Because in my personal opinion, It's not about showing the client multiple ideas. Quite the contrary. During my career as a graphic designer, I really learned there is just one design. There is the right design, and you as the artist, you need to determine which one is the best of the designs you created. And this is also the only design you're going to present to the client later on. The most emphasis in also cutting out very clean images is mainly for the center element of a design, meaning the most prominent and usually largest image element, which is setting the stage and the mood of the entire tattoo composition. Let me finish up the cutting out stage. We're almost done. In this area down here, I'm not going to cut into it because I actually like the idea that the meditator has some sort of a shadow coming down from here. So what I'm going to do is first zoom out and continue on the other side, because then I will keep this part of the image actually part of it and use this kind of little drop shadow we have here as well. In order to do this, I go back on my brush tool, increase the size of my bracket, press X to change primary and secondary color, and actually delete this part here. Let's fill out with a bigger brush size the middle part between the chest and the arm. Increasing the brush size whenever we can, but be careful that you don't accidentally cut off pieces which are part of the body silhouette. Decreasing the brush size. Get into those small areas just right behind the ear. Increasing it when we can. Probably by now you understand why I always work with a graphic tablet, because just the convenience by working with the pen on the screen, it gives me so much flexibility in quick editing, and even, as you can see, fading out and making nice and clean masks. Let's raise the size for the brush slightly more, because in this stage we did the majority of the fine outlining around the object, so we can move over and work a tad faster. It's not about that you will see every single of these elements in the actual tattoo composition, because obviously this picture is rendered in super high resolution, and if you design a tattoo design, it's still executed by a human, so that means I'm also not perfect, and I also have to skip on some of the details as well when I do the final tattoo of the design. And I personally believe that this is what actually many clients like about tattooing in general. It is the art of imperfection, because it is human skin, it is done through a human hand. There is no absolutely perfect straight line, because we are also just humans and we do mistakes, and those mistakes make something appear natural and therefore have a beauty. It happens quite frequently that clients come in and they show me reference pictures on their phone for their new tattoo designs, and in many cases they show me pictures of absolute perfect geometry, perfect line work, because they are digital artworks. And there's a huge difference between something hand-drawn or hand-created versus digital art, because digital art can create mathematic perfection, while the human hand cannot. The reality is, I'm not a printer, and I'm telling them straight off, I cannot create a perfect copy of something. Tattooing is way more an interpretation of a design. For example, the meditator for this design has quite a lot of detail. It was rendered with elements where you see the tiniest arteries, and to be honest, later on in the tattoo composition, I will have to simplify the shading, because You will never get a perfect copy of a photograph. And if you even see one of those in the internet, if it's too good to be true, it's most likely not true. Every person who tries to imitate something photorealistic will have to make some compromises here and there. And even if it's solely just about making the design later on tattooable. Because we will not work on white. Nobody will have a chalk white skin how we have it here on the display. It will be almost like a medium grayish tone we usually have as the base color for the tattoos. This is a very important step for me to keep in mind whenever I create a tattoo, because it's one thing if the design looks only great on the computer but cannot be translated into a tattoo. At this point I will also increase the brush size one more time, since all the fine detailing work is done, and I can pretty much rush all the way through and fill out all the edges and corners here. Now I gotta increase the brush even more, fill out the backdrop, but I make sure that I leave some space around the bottom where the reflection or the shadow from the meditator is, so we can use that later on for the tattoo. Alright, after creating the mask like this, we're gonna copy this object into our tattoo design, which is on this layer. There we go. I just drag and drop it over. And here we are. What you can see here is that I left the shadow, as I said before, so we can use it for the tattoo composition. Let's close this window and use the dodge tool. What we're going to do with the dodge tool is cleaning up with the highlight function the transition of the bottom shadow. So it has like the shadow has a tiny bit of a fade out there, but we still have the shadow casting from the hands and casting by the legs, and I really like that. Alright, let's have a look in our composition by putting the preview picture next to the design. And by saving the file, we are updating the preview of the tattoo template. And then we see already the meditator. Let's make some fine adjustment here to make sure that the meditator sits right in the middle of the design. That looks better. Let me just adjust the levels. Because in order to make this picture tattooable, I need to raise the contrast in the shadow and also slightly overburn the whites. Because the whites will be where the skin color, pretty much the lightest element in the tattoo, will be. But around the armpit and pectoral muscle, I just want to have a bit more kick of contrast, because it will make the design easier identifiable after it is tattooed and healed. I've created a new layer, and by checking the height of the document, I want to create a raster for the design. In this case, I want to have the design separated in 3 thirds, because that's a very harmonious composition and will look fantastic for a back piece. I adjust this ruler I made myself to approximately reach to the bottom and the top of the tattoo design we want to create. Now by snapping in the rulers into the 3 parts, I will have now a grid which will help me to create easier the tattoo composition. Now I'm creating a triangle in the background, which will be filled with the color white. So if I use the stroke tool by going on multiply, double click on the layer, stroke inside, and raise it up to 51 pixels, then we have a nice triangular shape in the background. And next step, I make sure that the triangle is in the background by masking out certain areas. This way we will create the illusion that the triangle is in the background and the meditator is in the foreground. Let's delete this bottom part here. Click one more time on the layer and selecting the layer. Using the paint bucket to create a second triangle in white, which I'm gonna scale down to use as a mask for later. Let's notch that a bit up. And I will go one more time in the levels because I want to create a mask. The shape of the triangle will be still hinted as a silhouette to extend over the arms and the leg areas, which I'm gonna show you in a moment. Let's first mask this area out. Doing some fine adjustments here. And now we're going to use the second triangle we just created, turn the layer off, as a mask for the dark parts of the meditator. I will create a second triangle on the top. To stay in our composition of 3 elements, the top triangle, the middle large triangle, and later on the bottom triangle. Let's adjust the position one more time, because the meditator doesn't seem to be fully in the middle of the document. And now we're gonna fill this triangle part with help from our mask. We select the mask one more time, inverse the selection, and erase all the areas around the shoulders and the head area. This gives us this nice triangular shape, starting right below the nose, going down to the chest. Let's also work one more time with the levels. And lower the brightness in the masked out areas a tiny tad more. We just want to make sure that later on that there is a clear contrast between the light parts of the meditator versus the dark parts. Let's open up from our resources the lotus. I'm just loading it here into Photoshop, copy and paste it into the final document. And I will set the layer on multiply because it helps us to position the lotus on the right place. Let's adjust the height. Turn off the rulers. And as you can see, the lotus is still appearing transparent since we set the layer on multiply. And now I'm gonna take just some white in the background of the lotus to make sure that the elements of the meditator and the lotus are not overlapping. I'm just fine-tuning here the leaves. And whenever I overdraw over the area, I just use simply the eraser tool by pressing the E key. And I think that looks already pretty good. Maybe down here slightly more. Now I'm going to delete this bottom part of the stem and just select a 1 pixel piece of the stem. By transforming it now, you can see that we have now this extension of this more three-dimensional stem. I'm just gonna add some more of the shadows here. I think it will look better if we move the lotus just a nudge up. Let's have some fun and play with the mask by sparing out a couple of graphic elements. I'm going to use the circle tool and start by creating the first circle. I'm going to copy and paste the circle and create approximately a 50% smaller version of the circle. After having the dirt circle now placed, I'm going to group this object because that becomes our graphic element we want to place on the chest of the meditator. I think it will look great right here. And now let's apply it to the layer mask. I really think it adds something graphic and playful to the design. The only thing I would like to do is brightening up the top circle. I save the document and refresh. So in the tattoo preview we see already the whole meditator. Let's open our resource folder one more time. I really like the aesthetic of this circle with the geometry around, and I think this will make a nice technological looking aura or halo around the meditator's head. The document is still on CMYK color space, so what I'm gonna do is I will switch that into RGB. Now opening the hue and saturation, just desaturate the picture, followed by the levels. I'm just quickly adjusting the whites to make sure that the entire object is really just black and white. because if we copy it now into our tattoo design here, I can just select multiply for the level. Let's resize the circle to find a good space for it. Maybe here, but I'm probably gonna shrink the circle just a tad more to make sure that we have enough space for the rays coming out. The smaller circles on the top part I'm probably going to erase because those might collide with the rays we want to place next. Let's zoom in. And to get rid of some of those very thin and tiny details, I'm going to use the mask tool and just mask out those objects. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that those elements look bad or anything. I only feel I need to delete some elements, like for example those squares within the circle, because those will be so hard to tattoo later on. And I'm kind of worried that those lines with the other circles around will just blend in together when the tattoo heals. Therefore, on purpose, I'm going to make the design more minimal by even deleting some details. It is way more important that the design translates well for a tattoo. It's really an act of self-discipline not to overdo tiny little details everywhere in the design composition, because later on during the tattoo I will be thanking myself so much that I don't have so many parallel lines. Sometimes you really need to just cut some details out here and there to also put more emphasis on the main focal point, which is in this case the meditator with the lotus flower. Sometimes less is more, and that also applies to our tattoo. Let's save the file so the tattoo template refreshes. And as I see it, we have to kind of rescale the design just a tad and place it more on the top part of the shoulder blades. I just opened up the halo we want to use. In this case, it came already with a transparent background, so it's very easy for us to copy and paste. I would just change the opacity. And let's place the halo right on top where the meditator's head sits. I know it looks already pretty cool with this massive halo, but in a tattoo composition, especially over the back where there's a curvature of the shoulders, this might not translate so well. So I really do want to have the rays behind the meditator, but I will probably just scale them down and make them more as a background element by deleting out the main lines in the middle of the design, because If you tattoo this actually, it would end up as just a gray area later on in a heel tattoo over a couple of years. Those lines are just way too close to each other, and that's why I'm just gonna delete them out here and bring back the focus on the round halo we just placed. I just used the square tool to mask out the bottom rays. I'm refreshing the tattoo preview by saving the file. And actually, let's lower the opacity, because the rays are really supposed to be just in the background. So later on for the tattoo, I will probably just take like 1 to 2 drips of black ink. Let's move on to the bird. I have already a nice black bird silhouette I created as a vector file earlier, but also with the bird it is still in the gray area, so let me just lower the brightness to black. And I will also need a white background. I'm selecting a solid color in white, and by holding down the control key and pressing on layer 2, which has the bird silhouette, you can see it will automatically select the outline of the bird. We're adding a symmetry ruler. And let's just give this bird a very simple and minimalistic shading. The silhouette will be very small, but I'd rather have some detail to it versus just a fully blacked out silhouette. Let's softening up the shades over here. And again, the birds will be very small. So let's keep it simple and as easy as possible by just adding some feathers here on the bottom part. Create more shadow on the create a bit more light reflex on the head, accenting some of the feathers here. Creating a softer gradient over here. Okay, that looks good already. Let's switch the symmetry ruler off, do some fine adjustments here and there. But overall, this bird is ready to use. Let's group it, create a new document. US paper size. And I will just drag and drop this bird over here. I don't need the original file anymore. And what I want to create is an interesting way how to place 5 bird silhouettes around the meditator. As a ruler, I'm gonna create myself a hexagonal shape. This is going to help me as a guide, because this hexagonal shape also reminds me of a 3-dimensional cube. And my idea is to place the birds in all 5 corners, and the bottom corner is where the meditator head will come out. Let's move this bird silhouette right into the top corner. Create another copy of the silhouette, and we will rotate it by 60 degrees. For the Opposite side we make it easy. We just go into transform and then flip horizontal. I create 2 more copies of the left and right bird. And as before, very easy, we will flip the object vertically. Turning off the hexagon reveals the shape. Let's drag and drop that also into our tattoo design file. And now I'm going to adjust the size to see how the birds will look. And I really want to find the balance between the head and the birds to make the birds not look too massive. Let's save this and have a look in the preview. And by looking at it, I still feel that the birds are too top heavy. Let's make the birds just slightly smaller, maybe down to 85%. I will repeat the procedure for the other birds as well. And setting them down uniformly down to 85% size. Save and refresh. And I think that looks already way better and way more balanced. Finally, let's create our bottom triangle. Let's start with a black shape here. And I think exactly here is the right sweet spot for it. So it also stays in our rule of thirds design. Don't worry, the triangle will not just be a heavy black triangle on the bottom. Even though it has also something interesting to use massive black work like that. But I feel the top part of the design is way too intricate. Therefore we're also gonna add some details down in the bottom triangle. Let me lower the opacity so the preview doesn't look too heavy. And let's go back in our resources folder. I found this very simplistic dotted geometric piece. I'm going to invert the layer, play with the levels to make sure it's real black and white. And copy and paste the file into our tattoo design. This is pretty huge. Let's adjust the size because we really just want to have it in the backdrop and creating some micro details around. And since those are dotted lines, they usually translate very well when you use a 3-point liner and maybe half of a cap of ink. I'm going to mask out all the elements which are overlapping with the birds, the halo and the meditator. The same rule applies here. Sometimes too much is just too much. That's why I rather take some details out of the design just to make more space for other details. It's almost like when you make music. For music you need to have a good selection of instruments. It doesn't help if you just have every instrument on full volume just playing something, then you will have chaos. It is the composition out of quiet elements and louder elements. In this case, the meditator is the louder element, while the geometry and also the halo will be more subtle in the backdrop. I'm actually kinda like this circle with some geometry here on the chest of the meditator. I'm probably gonna leave this element, just to create this connection from the foreground and the background. Now I'm going to clean up all the remains on the bottom, and I will also clean up the overlap where our white dots sit, because if we keep it for the tattoo with the dots crossing, then it might be that it distracts from the whole concept and the whole idea of the free negative space circles going up the neck. When I create my tattoo designs, I always make sure that I have a nice play between foreground and background elements. Sometimes overlaying, sometimes overlapping. For example, the big triangular shape, which morphs from the backdrop into the foreground. Finishing up the cleaning part. I just inverted the image into a negative, because by selecting screen as the layer mode, I can now see in all the dark areas where I still have overlap from the geometry. I'm now cleaning up all the overlapping elements. And let's go back to layer, multiply, and invert the image back. We save the file and see the preview. Let me use the time to close some of those tabs up here, because we're not going to need them anymore. I think by looking at it, I will just get rid of this one dotted line here. It looks just too much. And also clean the bottom part more. Let me select the birds. And just to make the birds more visible, I will create a levels layer, but it is very important that I set the group layer mode to normal, because in this case, the effect will only apply to the birds. Inside of the bottom triangle, I would really like to spare out another circle, because it stays in the same theme how we have it on the top chest of the meditator with the negative space circles. Let's do the same thing on the bottom triangle. Making sure it sits right in the middle. And by clicking Command I, we invert the layer. Just for myself to see the circle easier, I'm just going to create some stroke with a 3 pixel and a low opacity around it. Let's press OK. Selecting the triangle layer, creating a mask. And now I deleted the content inside of the mask, because I'm going to use a soft airbrush and a symmetry ruler and just create some light shades from all 3 corners into the triangle. Like that, on the bottom part as well. Those shades I can usually use some dot work shading and just create a medium gray gradient. Updating the file. And let's move over and create some more geometry circles in the backdrop of the layer. In order to find the right placement for the circles, I'm creating myself another triangle, which I'm just going to use to measure the 3 corners of the circles. I create the circles in white, create some stroke around by double clicking the layer. And now let's place the circles in all 3 corners of the triangle. The last one we set into the middle. We delete the triangle because we don't need it anymore. And set the layer mode to multiply. This way we can easier see if the circle is really sitting in the middle, which should be about here. I'm selecting the other circles as well. Set the layer mode to multiply. I group the object. And here we go, we have our 3 geometric circles. But I actually feel the circles need a thicker stroke. So what I'm going to do now is I will create a 12 pixel stroke versus a 3 pixel. Let me apply this to the other layers as well. And here we go. Resizing the object, and I think we found a very nice position over here. And now we're going to do the same thing. We created a mask for the group, and now we just spare out all the elements in the foreground which we don't need anymore. To save some time, I use the vertical ruler as well. Deleting the remainders in the front. Turning off the ruler, saving, and let's see. Yes, I really do enjoy the composition with the 3 circles because it creates a nice counterweight to the 3 triangles in the design. I always had an obsession with the number 3 and triangles in particular. Even back in the days when I still worked as a music producer, my personal favorite album cover art I've created was all surrounding around 3 and the number 3, triangles and optic illusions with the triangle. The triangle in many cultures represents manifestation, enlightenment and a higher perspective. So as you can see, the meaning of the triangle goes completely coherent with the rest of the entire meditator design. He's sitting there, liberating his mind to achieve enlightenment and higher perspective. I've extended the stem of the lotus, and as we had in our mockup, I'm going to start now creating this circuit board design. In order to create this circuit board, I will use the line tool with a line thickness between 8 and 5 pixels. And by selecting the line tool and holding the shift key, it gives me the opportunity to make 45-degree angles. Let's blend the stem in. We will select one more time the brush tool. And now I'm going to create a few dots in the design, because we use dots throughout the entire composition, and I feel they can add little easy to tattoo details throughout the entire design. Let's also add some in the circuit board. After saving, you can see in the preview picture on the back how the flow of the circuit board nicely goes down the spine. We switch one more time over to the brush tool and delete some of the elements over here, because it's just overlapping and it will create just clutter and confusion. I personally feel that the Lotus also will need more shadow on the bottom part. And maybe some more harder contrast shadows in the petals. I make sure that the shading has a nice soft gradient. And now I'm just going to put a few shadows here and there for harder contrast and blend them in with the eraser to get a nice soft gradient. I will also apply this to a couple of other petals. Let's save the file. And it looks like we are almost done. I only just want to have some more fade on the bottom part where the circuit board is, because those super thick black lines might look a bit boring later on in the tattoo. So I will probably fade them out in some more grayer shades. I do this entire process within the mask, so I'm not gonna use an eraser here. That gives me the opportunity to easily switch back and forth between my primary and secondary color to either raise the opacity or lower the opacity. I think that looks great, and we're done with our first entire tattoo composition. As a designer, it is also a skill to know when to stop, because let's face it, in every artwork and every design, we can keep going on forever. You need to know when the design composition is just right and has the right balance to call it a finished design.